Welcome to the next episode of our series, Cultures and Conversations, Preludes and Postscripts. My name is Mikey, and I'm joined by three amazing guests. The first is Natasha Petresheen Bachelay, who is a curator, educator, and writer. Welcome, Natasha. Lara Rudar, an artist, filmmaker, and environmental advocate. Welcome, Lara. And Philip Mawn, writer, editor, and co-founder of The Black Almanac. Welcome to all of you. Cultures and Conversations is a series of multidisciplinary events, cross-cultural conversations, and artistic interventions, which has been commissioned by Expo2020 Dubai and programmed by Alserkal. This series is entitled Preludes and Postscripts, and today's theme is an outlook on change. So since that is today's theme, I thought it may be good to go around the room briefly. Natasha, we'll start with you. And let me ask you a broad question. How much do you think about long-term change as you engage in your work?
Hello, Mikey, and hello to everyone who is listening. And thank you so much for this invitation. I'm very honored to be here with you again. So, yeah, it's a very beautiful question, I would say, because it literally asks us actually, what do we mean with the future? What do we mean with the past? You know, I follow very much. Since I started to work as a curator, I think the notions of temporalities are really defining us. And this is usually taking place on many different levels. So I would say that we always look for, of course, implementing, producing, so that something will happen. And this temporality is usually related to an event, an exhibition, a project. So it's quite packed in certain sense of temporality related to due dates. I don't use the word, for example, deadline. I use the word due date. And I think we will talk more about the language later on. But due date is a nicer word than killing your deadline, right? So this temporality or this prospective thinking when making, when curating, when thinking, or when exchanging is definitely there. However, personally, I'm an adept of what I call slow curating, thinking about how institutions should go slower. And this comes through my reading of Belgian philosopher Isabel Stengers, who has written in depth, actually claiming for a more, she compared, let's say, something that was related to a more quiet time of somebody that works within a garden, like an amateur gardener, let's say, in comparison to somebody that works on agriculture, on extensive agriculture. So the difference is vast. And what this slowness and slowing down means is indeed to find the time to actually think about the future. If we take that necessary time and not only, run after the deadlines, let's say, that are, of course, framing what we do, I think we can find sufficient place for enabling such exchanges that might have an impact for the future, might have an impact for the future of those that will be part of what we are doing. So part of, as a public or as our dialogue partners or artists or institutions, basically. And so I really believe more than in the future, I really believe into the long-term thinking.
Yeah, thanks. Lara, what about you? I mean, in my byline, I described you as being an environmental advocate, which I feel like that role, it's hard to divorce yourself from thinking about change. Advocacy, by definition, has to think about change. And I would imagine when you couple that with environmentalism, you have to think about really long-term change. I'd love for you to speak about how that sort of actually plays out in your work, in your process.
Sure. Well, I'm an 18-year-old environmental advocate, and I've been advocating for a majority of my life. And I only mention my age because I really think that children and teenagers actually always think about their futures, what they want to be when they grow up, how their lives will look in 10 to 20 years. So they always think about the future in some way or another. And my work concerns climate action. And right now with the new IPCC report, we all know that we have a really small window of change before tipping points and completely irreversible change. So I think I always am, with my work, concerned about the future, and just like billions of people in this world hoping and fighting for a more sustainable and equitable future that is safe for all of us. Because as well as, different effects like biodiversity and rising sea levels, this will also affect our society with famine, with socio-political issues. So it really is a social issue as well, and it will affect our futures, our job prospects, immigration, migration. So yeah, I think I always am.
Yeah. Philip, how about you?
Well, our project is set up as an almanac, which, these are ancient documents that were early instances of planning and trying to cope with the climate and changes that were coming. And, we set it up as an almanac. The project was founded in 2020, and we set it up as an almanac that would take us to 2050. But that deadline was sort of handed to us. There are all these interesting, huge, research data kind of projects by the UN and the Food and Land Use Coalition and so on, where they say, we need X amount of food by this date. We need to, bring down emissions by so much. We have to deal with the population will be 10 billion. We have to make more food than we've ever made before. So, the kind of the timeline was already established for us when we made that choice. But I think one thing about long-term futures is I really love the language Lara used there of being an advocate for the environment, or even an advocate for the future, because we take a very materialist stance, which is to say that we believe the future is a real place, that it exists and it's coming whether you like it or not. And I think, as human beings, we're really terrible at recognizing slow-moving risks, and we're really terrible at planning. And so, even though I know that we've mentioned the IPCC already, it was very interesting that the kind of the Part 3 working group summary that came out earlier this week or last week. One of the very interesting things about the language in that report was that it became much more comfortable with this idea of planning and coordination, rather than this kind of like decentralized sort of spontaneous kind of solutions emerging. I think there's a sort of kind of growing up going on where we recognize that some kind of level of planning and coordination is necessary, and that's what almanacs are about, I would say.
Interesting. Yeah. So I want to go around the room and tag onto this question, right? We've been talking about change as a society for my entire life. There have always been this sense of today's the due date, today's the deadline, tomorrow it's coming. This tidal wave is slowly approaching. We've hit the point of no return, or we're about to hit the point of no return. So maybe we can sort of go around the room, and I'd love to hear from your various vantage points, how likely is change? And when we think about this with a sort of a solutions-oriented mindset, or with any sense of creativity or optimism, who is actually capable of driving that change, if possible? Natasha, let's start with you.
Thank you. And thank you to Lara and Philip also for these beautiful introductions. I see the waves coming together. Listen, I come from a place that does not exist yet any longer as a country. So I'm, a result of something that is based on change. I was born in a place called Yugoslavia, and that has had a very violent breakup. And that violent breakup, unfortunately, resulted obviously in military conflicts that we still see a lot taking place today. The military conflict is obviously not the only violent thing happening, right? I mean, if we are talking about the climate deregulation, climate breakdown, also here the language changed. And I think recently this climate breakdown actually started to induce the idea that we, as Philip said, we really have to coordinate our actions. And change is based on actions, I would say. So change is really related to understanding that we are all very interdependent. I love to use that word, interdependency. For me, it's really the key concept of how we should look at things today. Interdependency, I think, is the basis of any change, which means that we understand each other, humans, non-humans alike. We have to see each other also being aligned on the same priority list, on the same, let's say that there should be less and less hierarchy given to us humans. I think that's definitely, and we see that taking place, not only in theoretical discourse, but also in practice. So I would say for me, the change is based on interdependent actions.
I absolutely love that, Natasha. I love that distinction. Lara, you introduced yourself as being, an 18-year-old. That was in the first sentence of the way you think of yourself. And there's always this trope about the children are our future. The children are our future. They're the ones who are going to drive the change. Does that resonate with you? Do you feel that is actually a onus that you are excited to take on? Do you feel like that is something that is a positive proclamation? Talk a little bit about that.
In all the conferences I've been to with the UN, all the leaders would always say, you're the next generation, your generation will be solving these issues, and putting a lot of importance on us, which was great. But the thing is, sometimes it's really important to go back into the past and see how we came to this place in the first place, to actually read the history and the context behind the issues. Climate change, the first COP started around 30 years ago. And so in 30 years, nothing has really changed. We're still on the same pathway. So it's really important to, learn from the mistakes of the past, from why there was inaction, and try and actually not repeat those mistakes. But I think when there's a lot of importance placed on youth and their, future power, also perhaps there's less importance placed on the people who are currently in power and should be doing the things that they are responsible for. Sometimes in these conferences, I was like, okay, but I shouldn't be here, as youth, as 18-year-olds. I shouldn't be in this room full of presidents and ministers, because they should be doing this work in a way themselves, as their own responsibility. It's great that they're asking for our contributions, but we're literally high school students, So it is great, the sense of collaboration. And I think, as Natasha mentioned, collaboration and this interdependence is really important between countries, between different generations. But I think accountability is also important for this generation. And also, responsibility for the older people to actually guide youth as well through this. Not only saying, yes, you are the future leaders, but actually giving us these skills and giving us opportunities and the guidance and support needed for us to become these leaders.
Yeah, it's interesting. Philip, I presume you were a teenager once upon a time too. And so I wonder if your understanding of change has sort of, morphed throughout your career. And when you think about how likely change is, quote unquote change is, and who is capable of driving that change, has your understanding of that question changed over time, sort of evolved and morphed?
Definitely. I have moved, I would say, from a position of kind of deep political engagement to sort of a kind of agnosticism towards parties, governments, multilateral organizations. I've become more interested, I suppose, in the systems approach to how change emerges. I also really love this idea of interdependence, but a word I use probably interchangeably is entanglement. Partly this is from it's famously used in The Origin of Species by Darwin. He refers to the entangled bank that we kind of that is the biosphere, and I think it's important for people to recognize that, there's no such thing as an individual human. Not only do we belong to this kind of superorganism that is human society, and that itself has become kind of a force of nature, right? Like, an individual could no more kind of direct the whole of human society than they could sort of stop the tide from coming in. But, we're entangled as a society with the biosphere, with the economy, with technology, with food. We have this kind of this perennial problem of kind of responsible consumerist approach to transforming a system, and one the food system itself also is another very large system and complex one, and one that no kind of individual has power over. So I think one of the goals with Black Almanac is to kind of point out where the blockages and where the actual kind of leverages for change are, because they're really hidden. We think about waste, for example, and while kind of overconsumption and food wastage at a kind of sort of individual private level is large, it doesn't come anywhere close to the wastage that is in crop residues and in processing and so on. It's the same with emissions, right? Like the emissions mostly exist at the point of production, not at the point of consumption. And so how do you access those things? It's really difficult. But in terms of maybe we can go on to talk about this a bit later. My personal approach to change or interested change has shifted largely, I would say, from what kind of managerial politicians are doing, or more often than not, finding creative ways to not do, towards how innovation happens, how things are funded, how technology can kind of be steered in certain directions. Because ultimately, through the research Black Almanac has done, I've come to believe that engineers sort of can be engineered. Change can be engineered, but not by a single individual. It's kind of more of a stately process than that.
So it's interesting. We're talking about change as if we're waiting for it to happen, right? But change is happening, right? Change is happening. It's just not the type of change we're hoping for.
It's inevitable. Change is not. Change is not an option. I mean, it's going to happen either way. The question is, how do you intervene to kind of direct it somewhere you prefer, preferable outcome?
Precisely. So I'm curious to ask, when we think about the change that we're hoping for, is it possible for it to be a friendly change that happens seamlessly, that is not disruptive and isn't almost sort of like this violent disruption of our current status quo? Is there an outlook for a undrastic change that can sort of right the ship?
Yeah, something that springs to mind immediately when you mention that is the question of automation, which is, which can be a really sort of catastrophic cascade of economic, social change, ecological change, if not handled in the right way. And I'd say we have a pretty terrible track record for dealing with this. I have kind of an understanding of automation that is essentially, as a sort of scaffold, that the idea that you kind of you create machines or processes that automate something, and then we all sort of hang up our boots and go home is not really how I understand it. You kind of you automate damaging and kind of inefficient and kind of harmful processes so that we can focus our energies elsewhere. There's so much during the pandemic, there's so much exposure of the kind of some of the sort of human costs of the food system as it currently exists. You had agricultural workers in southern Spain who've usually come over from Morocco who were then kind of trapped there almost in a stateless situation without access to healthcare, and because the borders closed. And you had viruses spreading through meat factories, meat processing factories. This was like a really big deal here in Germany where I am. There was a number of super spreader kind of moments came through this. And these are the sorts of things, meat to one side, but there was all this kind of argument about how that these people didn't want to do these jobs. That's kind of come in the aftermath, and it's kind of like this is somewhere that automation sort of should step in, but it can only do so when we have kind of a plan, like we've gone back to earlier, when we have some kind of reskilling and kind of basic income. There are all these kinds of different social supports, social safety nets. I mean, there has to be kind of you can't just let it sort of run rampant.
Yeah, I was just saying, in the climate space as well, there's always this mention of transitioning into green energy and abolishing the fossil fuel industry. And the word abolish is so heavy and strong, and it has power. But I think sometimes you really need to understand that you can't do it immediately because so many economies rely on fossil fuels right now. And so there are, other issues such as poverty and those who are now working in these industries that, as you mentioned, Philip, have to be supported through the upskilling and through education to make this transition into green renewable energies just for everyone, so that there are no incredible huge revolts and uprisings against governments who are trying to maybe push their countries into a more sustainable path. It can't be extremely immediate, but then at the same time, if it's not immediate, you also have that question of climate change becoming worse. So I think lots of people are frustrated with all the talks happening in conferences, nothing coming out of them. But it is so nuanced and so complicated, and action isn't being taken swiftly enough. But I think with the way that we're going about it, you need to consider all these different aspects and people's, well-beings, and really dedicate these resources to supporting people through this transition, through this change.
Absolutely. Natasha, go ahead.
I was just thinking, going back to your question about friendly change, I find that really almost like a utopian notion. It would go, I guess, alongside with what Lara and Philip were saying through their own perspectives, but could we make a revolution with care? So what would that look like? Meaning that all this, collective movement that we have to be part of in order to see if we stick to the issues of green transitioning or, how climate breakdown affects the social and political realities. So how could we do these revolutions with care? I think it's possible. But we have to be many. It's not possible to be just, it's neither possible just to be on one side and talk about it, even if it's in the most nuanced way. It can affect, but this talking in nuanced way affects others, affects people like, for example, me and my colleagues who work in arts. And then we bring forth, projects, ideas, we work on it, we talk about it. And this furthermore affects other people that are seeing this, that are experiencing this. So there is this web of affecting one another with a more careful way than just with the direct violence. So that would be, I think it's possible, although it's utopian, but the time again, so going back to the question of time and the future, I wonder how much time we have. And this is, I think, something that comes back very much in the questions about change and change related to ecological system, to ecosystems. What are these timelines? What are these, what are the temporalities of the change? So
yeah, and to pick up on the word friendly, I might want to shift it over to delicious, because one interesting thing, of course, is working with food is that the way people most obviously experience it is in terms of being an eater. And whenever we list out these kind of things that kind of in an incredibly functional and ideal world would happen by 2050. We think about the food system being, zero waste, carbon negative, all of these things, but it has to be delicious. It has to be joyful. And there's kind of that's a bit more sophisticated than it might initially seem, because there are all these kind of studies based on how people are drawn to certain foods. And of course, if you look at the long history of food, I mean, all foods had to be discovered. All foods had to be kind of invented, if you like. And the artificiality of food is something that we also look at a lot. But so there are studies, with, a very kind of hot topic and, would be, eating insects. And so, there's a study in Denmark where people were given mealworm truffles, and they were told, if you eat these, you're saving the environment. They were also told, if you eat these, people will think you're really cool. And people were way more drawn to do it if they thought there was some kind of, social benefit to themselves. And this kind of extends beyond something like insects, even as far as how we experience taste. There's tests where there's been studies where it's proven that if people think they're getting, a health benefit, or people think that they're getting some kind of personal advantage, or even just attaching positive statements to the things that they're eating. And you have this also with energy technologies and all kinds of other things. When these things are sold as being a positive, bold, uplifting kind of thing to be involved in, people are much more keen, rather than being scolded or even told. I'm sure people do want to do well, but the kind of imperative when it's a kind of personal benefit rather than maybe a societal benefit is very, very powerful. So this idea of desire and kind of mimesis and kind of the influence that we have on one another when it comes to food is very, very strong. And I would say that creating, freeing up. Because our food system is very stuck. We have a very set palate. We're nowhere near the potential we could be at. And so whenever we try and think about, what are the possible avenues for transformation that exist, very often we have to think about, things that people will be drawn towards. And I think there's a lot of room for improvement, which is that exciting thing.
Yeah, part of me thinks, like, when we think about the sort of the broader public, and I'm very much including myself in that public, I feel like we're negotiating with a toddler, and so often. And it's this idea of, you can't have this chocolate chip cookie, but we found some 0-calorie, sugar-free chocolate chip cookie, and that will solve all the world's problems, as opposed to just almost, I wonder if what needs to be said is, no more chocolate chip cookies for anybody. Like, we need to drastically change our lifestyle, change our, to go back to food, change our palate, change our taste. And so, Natasha, I want to come back to you for a second, because you were talking about your work and your colleagues in the art world. What is the role of art in trying to change the public's perception, or challenge the public perception, or invite the public into this conversation to reimagine what their lifestyle and what their life might need to be in the future if we're going to have this sort of transformative change?
Personally, I'm convinced it's immense, that this place is immense, the place of effective impact, of impact that doesn't necessarily take place immediately. So as with, let's say, theater, or with cinema, maybe. There is more and more of, I would say, of heightened awareness in the art world, at least those parts that I'm part of, that I collaborate with, that wants to use the space of visibility, because there is a lot of issues. Art goes together with visibility to the publics, but also visibility regarding where the current project might take you next. So going back to the future, artists are thinking a lot about their future while doing their projects in the present moment. So there is this space for visibility and addressing directly the publics. So that's why I, for example, where I work, or when I work as a curator, I always ask questions of, if I don't know the institution where I'm with which I'm collaborating, I always ask questions: who is your public? Who am I addressing? Who are we talking to? Can we meet them beforehand? Can we have programs that relate to, if we're working on an exhibition, can there be something that relates to public? So this almost pedagogical moment in art is very important, I think, at least for me. Furthermore, again, going back to my example, coming from Yugoslavia and during the war, and it's not unrelated to what we see now, for example, with the war taking place in Ukraine, and how several artists that remain there are sending their works, they're sending their drawings, they're sending their messages, actually, what's taking place there. It was similar during the Yugoslavia. There were the Yugoslavian conflict and the war. There were several artists that actually saved each other's lives through art projects. We have specific examples of that. For example, a group of artists called Neue Slowenische Kunst formed a state in time. They called it a state in time in order to relate to this new wave of nationalism that was taking place in Yugoslavia. And one of their projects was issuing diplomatic passports that were basically used for people to be able to escape from the conflict zones. You see, I mean, as modest as this sounds, I think art does play an immense role in refining our attention and refining our understanding of what is going on with us and around us.
Yeah, Philip, this reminds me of something that you said earlier about thinking on a systemic level, right? And thinking about institutions needing to change. Lara, I want to sort of rope you into that conversation and use that as a prompt for you and sort of your colleagues and folks of your generation. How many of your, or let me say it this way, do you get a sense that you and your cohort of activists are really thinking in terms of individual action, or do you feel like there is an engagement with the systemic problems and really thinking about the systems, not only the political systems, the business systems, the technological systems that may be creating some change that we don't want and preventing some change that we do want?
Yeah, I think the brutal reality is that at this point, individual action will not take us to the place that we are supposed to be. At this point, it is really about systematic change, about changing legislation so that businesses don't pollute as much as they are. Also, holding these companies that actually produce, like the top 30 companies produce like 60% of the carbon emissions. You'll have to fact check me on that. But, it is absolutely incredible how immense the contribution of businesses are towards increasing climate change. So, of course, everyone should be taking individual action to really limit their carbon footprints, to reduce their own individual emissions. But in order to create the change necessary to prevent catastrophic events and a crisis, the climate crisis is, what everyone is actually calling climate change right now, because I really think that language is also really important when discussing issues like these. In order to prevent the climate crisis, we really need to take broader action. As a UAE ambassador, one of my main jobs has been trying to empower youth and people in this country and to try and integrate climate education into the school curriculums, because they're not really as present as they should be in educational curricula. I realized that working with the UAE government, the Ministry of Climate Change and Environment, is that the individuals in power have to pass legislations, but in order to do so, they sometimes need encouragement and they sometimes need accountability, as I said. So when the public is engaged because they understand this issue and involved in these issues, taking individual actions such as, speaking out about these issues, going on social media, having discussions, actually maybe doing something positive in their work environments, putting pressure on businesses and governments, then they really need to actually react to this, right? So if the action is like that in the form of pressure, I think that is extremely effective. Because, I remember sitting in a meeting with Her Excellency Amina Mohammed, the Deputy Secretary General of the UN. And I literally couldn't believe that she said this. I was laughing quite a lot, actually, but she kind of really offhandedly mentioned, oh, but climate change is so sexy right now. And it's actually so true, because in these spaces, there's so much excitement and positivity surrounding climate change, as horrible of an issue it is. The individuals who are on the streets, who are in the classrooms and these institution businesses pushing for positive change, there is this genuine excitement and support. And when there is that, it creates this positive environment of collaboration, and people actually want to take action. Governments actually see it as something really, I guess, great to actually pursue. So kind of, I guess, subverting this negative issue into a positive one and creating this environment, as Natasha had said, of care, I think can really influence the way that we go ahead with these, with facing these problems.
Yeah. Natasha, I'd love to have you chime in on this, because there is a risk, right, in the discourse for things to become taglines, for things to be co-opted, for things to be branded. There is, huge corporate interests that like to talk about structural racism and talk about forced migration and colonialism and decolonizing and climate change. And it's easy for these to get turned into marketing campaigns. How do you think about, your work deals with this idea of rehumanizing the things that are structurally dehumanized. How do you sort of think about that? I'd love for you to shed some light on that.
I would just go, if I may, a little bit back to Lara, because also what I realized I wanted, and we call it art world as if it's like a planet on its own. It's so also very dismaying sometimes. We contribute to the carbon footprint, the careers of artists, the exhibition making, etc., is heavily dependent on the transportation of objects and humans, right? So there has been a lot, I think, also within the arts institutions, but also among artists, a lot of reflection that go with using other materials, using non-toxic materials, using organic materials, creating one's own paper, creating material with which to draw, learning about how to reduce the carbon footprint when making exhibitions, etc. So I think this is also where what we were talking previously about the change and how it cannot be individual comes in also for the art world. And I'm very happy to see that these things are moving, and actually quite fast, very much on systemic level. And based on that, the art world still is very related to capitalist system. So it has been built on it. It has been built on accumulation. Collections are accumulations of objects as such. So there is this idea of certain structural hierarchy that also necessarily involves structural discriminations within the levels of the ways in which art institutions are organized, the ways in which they work. For example, just about the notions of cleaning and caring for institutions. Usually these are parts of, the employees in the art institutions still are very much racialized wherever you go. They are either forced migrants, sending money back to, cleaning and security staff, for example, that actually are those that enable, that actually we enjoy what we see. So it's a very important issue, I think, of this issue of critical care, as we call it, in relationship also to the question, who cares about the institutions? So that would be maybe I don't know if you see that it's related. I see it very much related to what we're talking about, because it is part of this discussion. And so also this very strata of what it makes actually an art institution is very much part of the work of many artists.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, I'm going to end with a simple question to each of you to sort of wrap up what has been a very lively discussion. So at one of the events at Expo2020 Dubai, I think it was called Program for People on the Planet, there was one of those standard surveys that gets sent out to participants and organizers. And there was a bunch of different questions, feedback questions. And one of the questions at the end said, did this event or activation of this week inspire you to take personal actions to make the world a better place? And when that email, arrives in your inbox, it's easy to sort of greet it with a cynicism and an eye roll and say, come on, do we really need inspiration? Do we need more than that? Do we need more than individual action? But each of you are being productive in your field and are trying to sort of deal with these very, very heavy issues head on. And so I imagine that you need a sense of something to combat that cynicism, to sort of put one foot in front of the other every single day. But cynicism is productive and can be helpful. So maybe let's start with Lara, let's start with you. How do you manage that balance of optimism and cynicism, a sense of possibility and a helplessness about where we are and where we might be in the future?
Well, first of all, I wanted to thank Alserkal and Expo for actually organizing these events. The theme of Expo was connecting minds, creating the future. And I think that they really did deliver on this promise. To meet with people who are working towards the same goals as you, but with vastly different experiences and perspectives was so enriching. And I definitely learned so much, talking to other participants in the climate and biodiversity event that I was a part of on stage, but also off stage, during our private conversations and just discussions about the issues in a more general sense. So I think all these conversations definitely did inspire me because a majority of the people who are doing this program with me have years and years of experience and have really been in this industry the majority of their lives and have this wisdom. And to listen to them, just discuss these issues with them was so important for me as, youth looking into studying these issues at university and then as a career working on these topics. So I think sometimes people actually don't see how inspiring it is to actually listen to someone, an expert who has been working on these issues, because just one lecture, just one speech can really inspire a young person or even like at any age to start their environmental journey, to start fixing the problems. So yes, I think my exchanges here were very valuable. And I think really being a part of the youth climate movement has exposed me to the power that youth have in amplifying climate action. And of course, there is a lot of cynicism, but there is a lot of positivity and support as well. And I think one thing I've learned as well is that youth are stubborn optimists, a phrase that we love a lot in the climate movement, because stubborn optimism is something that is really necessary when you're in this field, because there are a lot of really, upsetting conversations when you're constantly surrounded by new reports coming out, the impacts that climate change is having on the world through the news. You really can fall into this rabbit hole of cynicism. It's really important to have this, environment of support and this network of people who are there for you emotionally as well as just mentors educationally. So yes, I think that's how I kind of balance the cynicism, being surrounded by people who are really caring and who are supportive, and people who are really striving to achieve the same goals as I am, because at the end of the day, it's all about collaboration. It's all about coming together to solve this issue.
Sure. Great. Natasha, how about you? I saw you nodding along with my question as I was asking it.
Lara, this was so beautiful. So thank you very much. I cannot find other words than what you said. So the support structures are those that really it's either family, it's either kinships with plants, with animals, with rivers, with spirits, support structure that in which you can find again and again the energy and the optimism that you need to go further, because there is a lot of cynicism and there is a lot of violence in our immediate environments, not only socially, but also in working environments. And also this is, I think, part of what I see at least for myself, and what was also related to our discussions, for example, which I was part of at the Expo, I could really sense indeed that it is very important with whom you work, with whom you associate, in order to produce, in order to work on projects or on ideas that lead to certain change. It's very important with whom you associate and how you feel as a group together. We have found it, for example, before, like during the pandemics, I co-founded with several artists here in Greater Paris region an initiative called Initiative for Practices and Visions of Radical Care, where we work on mutuality, which is something that doesn't exist in the art world. You know, it's based on capitalist system, whereas we just try to put our competencies in order to help each other. Members of this initiative are, for example, some artists that came to Paris to live as refugees. Some are healthcare practitioners, some are philosophers, and we just basically became a big kinship structure. And we see like how in 2 years' time, it has affected several of our friends and colleagues, and people are curious about it. Definitely an event of that kind of massive attraction, which is Expo, and especially this one. I would claim that, during its duration, many things happened, many sad things, but also many probably good things happened. And I think that the idea of planting the seeds with what we do every day is something that I take with me when cynicism tries to overcome me.
Great. Philip, how about you? Take us away.
Yeah, I also want to pick up on what Lara said about the kind of sensationalism of the daily reports of, how doomed we all are. I mean, I'm very anti this idea of collapse and panic, to be honest. I don't find it particularly useful. And, a lot of the focus in the last 10 years has shifted from kind of traditional journalistic sensationalism towards social media, as if that's the root of all evil. But I think it was already pretty bad, to be honest, before social media. And I say this as somebody who's worked as a journalist. Inspiration and kind of personal, changes. That's where the question kind of came out. I mean, I'm quite realistic, I think, about our project. I think, it's a speculative, almanac whose goal is kind of communication and really picking up on some of the sneaking suspicions I think people have that all is not as it seems. Perhaps with food, I don't see, necessarily us as having this kind of great impact, but what we're doing is cataloging the work of some really amazing people, people who are working in policy, people who are working in science, in kind of in innovation and technology. And there's definitely a genuine desire to kind of fix agriculture and to eat, better, or for people to just do whatever they can in that kind of small way. And so, as a kind of final thought, I mean, one thing is that I think that there ought to be a new vision of what farming looks like, because it can't look as it did in the past in the future. And I find very suspicious of this kind of very prominent, especially quite middle class idea that we somehow need to go back in order to go forward. I don't think that the past was a inherently benign place. Throughout most of our history, humans have been spending almost all of their time trying to secure a safe, nourishing food supply. And, increasing numbers of us are able to achieve that at this point. And so, a lot of the kind of issues with the food system are placed on this issue of scale, right? Like that it's doing things at scale, but at the same time, we're achieving equality at scale as well. And as I find that very valuable and kind of a great achievement. And so, I think that we've done very well at coming to a place where we're offering people safe food that is what it says it is. I mean, you know, so much of history is about adulterated, you know, bread with like, you know, lice in it and kind of all of these things. And I think we've got beyond that, but now we need to go the next step, which is to address the source of production as well. So it's not only that it's not going to poison you, it's not going to poison the place that it emerged from as well. But you know, there are some really amazing people that work in this, and you know, there are kind of reasons to be hopeful. And you know, and they're just trying to sell newspapers with these headlines. You know, you should never forget that. Speak to the scientists. I mean, their perspective is often much more nuanced and often quite different to what you think you know, they're likely to say.
Sure. Well, I appreciate you all taking the time to share your perspective and share some of the thought behind your work. So Lara, Philip, Natasha, thanks so much for being a part of this.
It was so fun. Thanks so much. Thanks to everybody for your responses.
Yes.